Good morning. Welcome to Prophetic Lifestyle with Bernard Bolton, where we are making the prophetic practical, integrating the prophetic into everyday life and seeing the future now. And listen, I hope that you're seeing an incredible future. I know every day when I wake up, I'm thanking the Lord for today, but I'm looking ahead to the future, and my future is looking bright and wonderful. So today is Friday, and on Fridays, we like to speak on ministry and the marketplace, not ministry in the marketplace. So we're not trying to integrate ministry into the marketplace. We're actually releasing what I believe is a new understanding, though I've seen several others also uh, lifting this banner. But I believe we are now living in a time where those who are called to ministry do not have to be in one lane. Ministry doesn't have to be your total life. It doesn't have to be your total focus. You can be in ministry. You can serve God in ministry and serve the congregation in ministry, but you can also be in the marketplace doing business, creating products, sharing programs, creating email lists, and doing all of this for the purpose of building an economy, creating an economy, creating streams of income, creating wealth for yourself, for your children, even to your grandchildren, your third generation. Okay. And so this is a passion of ours. This is an assignment that the Lord has given us. And I believe we are in the era where we're going to understand those who are called to ministry, whether you are an apostle, a prophet, a teacher, evangelist, or pastor, those who operate in the ministry of gifts, helps, administration, those who are in the ministry of the scribe, those who operate in the ministry of the scribe, either in the creative, in instructional, or in administration. We are coming to understand that we can do ministry and be in the marketplace where we are making money. We are connecting with clients and customers, and we are bringing the best. We're bringing our creative excellence into the marketplace. But today I am talking about, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my phone. I just got a text message from a very important person. And so, yes, okay. So today our focus is on ministry. Unfortunately, this was supposed to be our discussion last week. I'm not exactly sure what happened. I might have been working. I'm doing part-time work. I mean, I've got my hands full, both in ministry and the marketplace. So today we want to talk about ministry. And on each Friday, we are either talking about ministry or we're talking about marketplace. But please understand, we're always connecting ministers who are in ministry and who are in the marketplace. All right. So today I'm talking about, am I called to ministry? I lead a prophetic network that is its name is Renaissance Prophetic Network. We have some incredible partners and ministers in this network. We have pastors and prophets in this network. Of course, it is an apostolic network because we lead it as an apostle. And what is an apostle? An apostle is a vocational gift. It is a grace gift, and apostles engage in vocational ministry. I would never take my apostleship into the marketplace. I would never try to build an apostolic ministry in the marketplace. The Lord called me to the marketplace, told me to start my own business when I when I published my first book in 2009. And I'll never forget, I heard the Lord say, I'm going to teach you how to have dominion. That's why I started the business. That's why I started the business of book selling and it has evolved into other businesses. Okay. But ministry is also a part of my life. It is a part of my identity. I said yes to the call to preach when I was 17 years old, and I came out of the Baptist church. And in the Baptist church, we believe that if you're going to be in ministry, if you're going to be in the preaching ministry or the pastoral ministry, you have to have a call from God on your life. And so I heard God visited me. I had several experiences with the Lord. And and so in my 17th year, matter of fact, it was a couple of weeks before I turned 17, I said yes to the call to preach, which was a call to ministry. Now, I am a preacher. I am an apostle. I am a teacher. I really function more now as a teacher than a preacher because I'm operating in a kingdom. I'm operating in the kingdom of God, the kingdom where Jesus Christ is king. And so I am operating more as a teacher, even though I am an apostle. Okay. So as an apostle, I'm teaching more than I'm preaching, but I said yes to the call to ministry. Okay. It has changed in these 37 years since I first said yes, because in the Baptist church, a call to ministry meant that you was going to become a pastor. Even though there were some who became evangelists, but if you were going to be in full-time ministry, full-time vocational ministry, where you were devoting your life to the ministry, the only path was to become a pastor. And that's what I became at the age of 26. And for 23 years, I operated in the I operated in the gift of pastor. Okay. But then in 2012, the Lord revealed to me that I was an apostle. It was a revelation. It was I'm careful with the language because I want to convey to you who are watching, I want to give you a clear understanding of what calling is. Because one of the problems in the church is we think that God only speaks in callings. All right. But God doesn't just speak in calling. If you understand the prophetic God speaks to us more than in calling. So though I was called as a preacher, and I said yes to the call to ministry because that was how I engage in the ministry God was calling me to. But then in 2012, I'm 45 years old, and the Lord revealed to me. And then my mentor, she was becoming my mentor at the time. She confirmed. Okay, she didn't call me, Apostle Teresa. She confirmed that call. And matter of fact, she didn't even know that the Lord was speaking to me. The Lord gave her a word of knowledge where she spoke to that revelation that I was an apostle. And so now I'm pastoring in a traditional denominational church that doesn't even recognize apostles or prophets or teachers or evangelists. They only recognize the gift of the pastor. And you had to be called to preach in order to qualify to become a pastor, which was a congregational call. Now, when I was called to congregations, the first congregation I was called to, and I really wasn't planning on doing it this way, but I feel led of the Lord to share my testimony of the ministry. And when I was called to the first congregation I served in West Virginia, I prayed and I asked the Lord, was he calling me to that congregation? But it wasn't the call of God that made me the pastor. It was the call of the congregation. It was the election of the church. The church had to come together in a meeting where they held an election, and they had to vote on whether they would extend to me a call to become their pastor. And so that's how I became a pastor in each of the three churches that I worked in, or that I led as a pastor. All right. And so just like they could vote me in, they could vote me out, even though that was never a something that I faced. I never faced being voted out or being fired by any of the churches that I pastored, but I understood that these people who called me can uncall me. But the call to ministry from God is a lifetime call. It is irrevocable. That's why the Bible says the gifts and callings are without repentance. God never takes back a gift or a calling that he extends. And so that's why I believe I am a preacher to the end of my life. Probably a preacher when I go to heaven. I'm not sure if we need preaching in heaven. I know preaching, now preaching is evangelistic. So preaching is for those that don't know the Lord, but then preaching is also the declaration of the kingdom. The kingdom is here. The kingdom is now. So there may still be preaching in eternity. There may still be preaching in eternity, because the preacher, he heralds, he shouts and proclaim that the kingdom is here and the kingdom is now. And he announces that the king is present. So that's the call. So that is the call to ministry. But I cannot really say that my coming into the apostolic or into the apostleship was a call. It was a revelation. God began to show me. He opened my eyes to see that he had, in fact, that from the birth, from the entrance, from the exit, rather, of my mother's womb, he had set me apart for this. Doesn't mean that I was an apostle at the age of 5, 15, or 25. There had to be a maturing. I believe that's what I went through. And I went through hell to mature, because I faced a lot of opposition. I had a stronghold of work mentality. And so I worked hard. I worked myself in my second church. I worked myself into burnout, because it was about performing. It was about working so the people would accept me. And I was working, and I was building, and I was creating ministries. And sometimes I was teaching and preaching 3 to 4 times a week. And after 3 years, I was burned out. And I did what most pastors do when you burn out: you look for another place to go. And so then I went to the third church that I was called to, and that was an exercise in hell. When I tell people I've been to hell and I've seen the devil, I refer to that church. I won't even mention the state, but I said that state is the doorway to hell. Okay, but I shouldn't say that, because the state had a lot of wonderful people and it was a wonderful place. But for me, it was hell. And so the call to ministry, let me get into that, because I've been talking a long time. Thank you for being so patient and in watching. But what is the call to ministry? Okay, and I want to use, of course, we want to get an understanding of the call to ministry from the scriptures. All right. So one of the things I stress in Renaissance is, if there's a calling on your life, you need to be able to identify that in the scriptures. All right. I'm not talking about getting a prophetic word, even though a prophetic word can be confirmation to a call. One of the gifts of wisdom that I operate in is I can sense a call on a person, but just because I sense the call doesn't mean that I have, it doesn't mean that I can sense a call. It doesn't mean that I'm calling the person. And one of the things that troubles me is a lot of you are looking for a human calling. You're looking for even a mentor to call you. The call of God comes from God. And so how can you be called to ministry if you're not hearing God or if you don't have a relationship with God. It may have been prophesied to you. I don't doubt that, but a prophetic word is not a call from God. Okay. You have to experience God or hear God for yourself. All right. So Bezalel, well, actually, I want to start with Abraham because Abraham was called. I won't say he was the first one, but Abraham was called by God. God spoke to him. Abraham was living in a very dark country, Ur of the Chaldees. He was an idolater. He worshiped many gods. His family worshiped many gods. But in Acts, it says the God of glory appeared to him and God spoke to him. And so a calling is normally when you've been called to ministry, you hear God. Now, how can you hear God if you're not prophetic? Okay, I wasn't prophetic when I heard the Lord back at the age of 16. I heard the audible voice of God. The only time I've ever heard God speak in a human voice, God spoke to me and called me to the ministry. And he specifically called me a preacher of righteousness. I knew what that term meant because that was what Noah was called, a preacher of righteousness. And I heard God. His voice came in my room on a Sunday morning in January 1984. I was up getting ready to go to Sunday school. I had been because I was a faithful member of the church. As a matter of fact, I was a Sunday school teacher. I had been a Sunday school teacher for over a year. My pastor had given me a class of my peers, teenagers. And so I was up. And matter of fact, I hadn't got up yet. I was lying in bed and I heard God. He spoke to me in a human voice. And then a few weeks after that, he came to me in a dream. Now it would be almost 30 years before I came to understand how God speaks in dreams. But God did speak to me. He showed me in a dream. And in that dream, God was showing me that, he was showing me what would take place if I decided not to accept his call to preach. I saw it in a dream. All right. And so most of the call is hearing God. Okay. And listen, it really doesn't matter whether you're prophetic or not, because you will know when it's God. You'll know his voice. You'll know what he's saying, and you'll have understanding. So God is not, he's not put off by, I'm not prophetic. I don't know how to hear God. I don't know. God is not put off by any of that. And if you just consider that, all right, if you just consider God is speaking, many of you have already heard God. And so because if you are a believer, the Holy Spirit lives in you, the potential for the prophetic is in you. You just have to accept it. All right. All right. And so Abraham heard God, and God told him to leave, to get out. That was all he heard, was to leave where he was and to go to the land that I will send you. And then it was later, and I don't know when God said this to him, but then God says that I have called him to instruct his family. And so there was a call where Abraham heard the voice of God. And matter of fact, I want to read, because the call of Abraham is in Genesis chapter 12, but I do want to read Isaiah 51. Okay. Isaiah 51, and this is the New King James Version, and verse number 2, it says, look to Abraham. This is Isaiah, the prophet, prophesying. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who bore you, for I called him alone and blessed him and increased him. So most of the time, when God calls you, there's a principle which is called the alone principle. God calls you alone. Okay, now the confirmation of that calling may be in a congregation or it may be in your leadership, but God first deals with you alone. And that's how it was with me. God came to me alone. And then after I said yes, then I went to my pastor shared it with my pastor, shared it with my grandmother, shared it with my mother. And then the pastor said, "You're going to preach next month." I was frightened. He says, "You're going to preach," because back then in the Baptist church, I don't know if they're still doing it that way, but back then in the Baptist church, you had to preach what was called a trial sermon. And the trial sermon was you was on trial and the congregation was trying you. And even though I don't know anyone who was ever rejected, but then the congregation would vote on whether you have been called or not. Now, even though it was God doing the calling, it was the church or the congregation that was going to acknowledge your call and then give you a license. Okay, that was the procedure. And listen, I agree with that, because even though God is calling you alone, your calling needs to be recognized and acknowledged in a congregation. Now, I'm not talking about putting you on trial, judging you, and being judged by a bunch of people who don't even hear God. Because in the church that I was going to, most of them folk would have had a nervous breakdown if they had heard God. So here they are voting on me hearing God, but they was voting on my preaching. They was voting, and the Spirit of God fell in that service where I preached. The Spirit of God fell, and there was people falling out in the Spirit, and there was, high emotions. A lot of my family was there. A lot of my relatives from my father's side, and my father had died 10 years, and so there was just a lot of feelings that, emotions were high, and the church voted that they didn't even wait for the business meeting. Pastor said, "Do we accept Bernard as a preacher?" And they voted yes. Okay. And so, and if anybody had voted against me in that service, they might not have gotten out of that church alive. Praise the Lord. Okay. And so, but listen, you're called alone. God is dealing with you alone by yourself. Okay. All right. Now, next thing I want to look at is Bezalel was called. Bezalel was called. But Bezalel, he was called to ministry, but he was called to the ministry of creativity, because he was called. Let's go to Exodus 31:2. So I'm just going to do a little teaching, and I try not to go over half an hour. I may go over half an hour today, but Bezalel was called. This is what the Lord spoke to Moses in Exodus 31 verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Ur, of the tribe of Judah." Okay. Now, Bezalel was called, verse number 4 says, he was called to design artistic works, to work in gold and silver, in bronze, in cutting jewels for setting, in carving wood. And so Bezalel was called by God to create the tabernacle, to create a place for worship. And so that was the ministry of, I call it the ministry of creativity, because Bezalel call was not to the marketplace, but it was called to ministry, to create a place of beauty and to create a holy place where the people of God could meet God. It was called the Tabernacle of Meeting, or the Tabernacle of Testimony. And it would be the central place for Israel where they would go and meet God. And Bezalel was given, he was given the gifts. Okay. He was given the artistic design. God not only called him, but God gave him the gifts, the ability to create this beautiful place. And not only did he create the tabernacle, but he also created the clothing for the priesthood. Beautiful clothing, creative. All right. But it started with a call. And there are many of you, you're not just called, and I want to minimize the call to preach or the call of, to operate in one of the gifts, to be a apostle or prophet. But there are many of you who have a calling. But again, this is in ministry, where you have been given incredible gifts of design and creativity. And so Bezalel was called. Now, this is some of the things I want to talk about calling. Calling is when your purpose, which is what you was born to do. Okay. Even though my purpose has been enlarged, I believe that I was born to preach. The Lord gave a word to my father, who was not prophetic. He was a Baptist preacher, Baptist pastor himself. And I don't know, he did have some experiences with the Lord, but they didn't call it prophetic. When God called him, he asked the Lord for a sign like Gideon, and the Lord gave him a sign. The Lord had to give him a sign because my father was an unbeliever. And God called him out of the world, and then he called him into ministry. And my father asked for a sign. He was living in Alabama on a farm, and God gave him a sign. And then he moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where he became a pastor in 1955. But my father said before he died that the Lord told him that one of his sons would preach the gospel, and that was my father's desire. He had fathered 7 sons. I'm number 7. That's a prophetic sign. And he said he didn't know which son, but he said the Lord told me that one of my sons would preach the gospel, or would continue in that generational pattern that he had established. And so calling is when purpose and timing connects for you to begin to fulfill your assignment, to fulfill the assignment that you was born to do. And so my purpose, even though my purpose has been enlarged and I'm doing a lot of things, but the one thing I can never escape is that I was born to preach, and I was born out of a prophetic word. And that was the word that the Lord gave to my father. And so I was born to carry the gospel. All right. So when I was 17 years old, it was time for me to step into what I had been born in. Purpose and timing connected to begin this assignment that I would carry for my life, that I would carry in my life. And even though I'm doing a lot more now as an apostle, I'm an apostolic mentor. I'm building a network. I mentor prophets. And listen, what I do is very fulfilling. But listen, I still go back to my purpose and what I was born to do. Calling also means that you are yoked to God, who then empowers you or gives you the grace to do. See, there is a grace that comes when you are called to ministry, and that grace is the supernatural influence of God operating in you and then operating through you, giving you the ability to do what you're called to do. When I started preaching, y'all, I was not only introverted, I was very shy and very self-conscious. I remember the first time I preached, I never looked at the audience. I never looked up from the Bible. I was petrified. Okay. And I never looked up until I hit that high point. There's a high point in Baptist preaching. That a preacher meets and we're hooping and all of that. And the people were shouting. And then I looked up, and I preached myself into exhaustion. I remember falling into the arms of one of the guest ministers who was there, who had been mentored by my father. And so I preached myself into exhaustion. But listen, there is the call is actually being yoked to God. So if you're outside of God, it's not that God will not call you, but there's a connection with God. You have to be connected to God to say yes to that. Okay. And so I believe God can call you outside of relationship, but I believe one of the keys to being called to ministry is that you need to be in relationship with the Lord. Jesus called the 12 to first be with him. which means that they was in relationship with him. They were in relationship with him. They were with him. They were living with him, walking with him. They were sharing his life. They were learning from him. They were talking. They was building relationship. And so the being yoked. And so when Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, what he's saying is get in a relationship with me. Some of you want to be in ministry, but you have no relationship with the Lord. You don't pray. You don't read the Bible. You don't search for revelation. You're not a part of a congregation. You're not in a community. You're not trying to discover your spiritual gifts. Being yoked to God, okay? Because that is the power. That is what that yoke, there's a grace in that yoking. There's a grace that is available, divine, the influence of God operating in you. God influence operating in your spirit, man, operating in your soul, even in your body, and then you moving into in that influence because God has called you to ministry. And then number 3, the calling is God already has given you gifts and given you abilities. And then God says, go forth and create something for my glory. Bezalel created the tabernacle and the garments of the priesthood for the glory of God. But when you are called to ministry, you are called to be creative. One of the things that troubles me about ministry is how a lot of people are called to ministry, but they're not creative in their ministry. They just conform and they copy. They copy their favorite apostle, their favorite prophet. And I mean, I've been singing for years, and when you are young in ministry, there's of course you until you find your voice, you're going to copy the voices of others. I was unique though. I never tried to copy. There were many men who I admired and loved, and I would listen to them for hours. One of them was the father of Aretha Franklin. Many of you came in the Baptist church probably have heard of the Reverend C.L. Franklin, who was considered one of the greatest African-American preachers in the 20th century. I used to listen to his albums for hours. I just loved the preaching of Reverend C.L. Franklin. So much to the point that one of my cousins challenged my call. He said, Bernard ain't been called to preach. He been up in his room listening to those records. Okay? And so, but listen, there was but I never tried to preach like C.L. Franklin. I never tried to preach like Reverend Jasper Williams or some of the more premier Baptist preachers. And I was in Cleveland, which was a mecca for preachers. Some of the greatest preachers in the Baptist church pastored in Cleveland. But I never tried to be like any of them. Number one, because my family was watching me. My grandma was watching me. And if I tried to sound like anybody, I was going to get checked hard. But for a lot of young ministers, a lot of my friends, a lot of the young ministers my age that had started preaching when I did, they would sound like their favorite. All right. But at some point when you find your own voice, then you have to start using your own giftings and become creative. And so even though I didn't know it, I was always creative in ministry. I was always preaching messages that was not preached. I was preaching about Jabez years before the book came out. I think his name was Bruce Wilkerson. And I was preaching about Jabez, before the book came out. And so I was creative in my preaching. I would take obscure people from the Old Testament and develop full messages and sermons on them, because that was the creativity in my ministry. All right, and I'm going to be done. Jesus called the 12 disciples to become apostles. The disciples, as disciples, they were called to learn. They were called to be with him. They were called to be instructed. They were students. But then after, and I won't say that they was complete. They were done. They had graduated from being disciples. But then at some point, Jesus called them to be apostles. So there is a call to the apostle. I'm just saying being an apostle may not always necessitate a call, but it should necessitate a revelation. And so when they became apostles, then they took on a ministry, the ministry of the apostles. They became the foundation of the community that the Lord was calling. And so they were invited. Jesus invited them to become apostles or to become a part of an apostolic movement that, even though it became invisible, the apostolic movement has always been in the congregation or in the community. In the 2nd century, apostles were replaced with bishops. But I believe we've always had apostles, even when we didn't recognize it. When Martin Luther tried to bring Reformation to the Catholic Church, Martin Luther, he elevated, or rather he made prominent, the office of the pastor. And that's why we've had pastors for the last 500 years as the dominant gift. Even though the pastor is a gift, it is one of the 5 gifts, but it was never supposed to be the dominant gift. But that was Martin Luther. He was trying to move the church from the bishops and the popes. And so he felt that being a pastor was more akin to the movement of Reformation. But the Lord started restoring first the gift of the prophet, because the prophet had to declare and announce what God was doing. And so we saw the return of the prophet in teams in the 1980s, the Kansas City prophets. I believe that was the restoration of the prophets to the church in the Kansas City prophet. They were teen prophets. There were groups of prophets. There were no longer solitary prophets, even though throughout the church there probably were solitary prophets. I had the privilege of meeting, and I'm going to try to be done in the next 2 minutes. I had the privilege of meeting Prophet Bob Jones, who walked in an authority and a realm of revelation, supernatural signs, wonders, and miracles that has not been seen in a lot of prophets in our current times. I believe he went to heaven in 2015. I met him in 2014. And he was a prophet as a small child. And so, but he was a solitary prophet. Another prophet that I believe started in the 70s, but he was solitary, was a prophet that I met who is now an apostle in Cleveland, Ohio. But the return, the restoration of the prophet is what took place in the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, we had the restoration of the apostles that then brought us into the 21st century. So now we have the gifts now we have all 5 gifts operating: apostle first, then prophet, then teachers, then evangelists, and then pastors. And so as a result of having these gifts, now we are positioned to become the bride of Christ and to become the mature body and to become the one new man. Now, because all of the gifts are present and available, now the church can move into maturity. All right. And so that is what the calling of the ministry necessitates. I would listen, if one of the areas that I coach in is the areas of ministry and the marketplace. So if you're interested in learning how to be a minister, how to do marketplace, then contact me. Go in the description box. There's an email address there. You can write me and we can do a strategy session on me helping you navigate between ministry and the marketplace. Want to encourage you to get my book, Okay, Prophetic Dreams and Vision Handbook, and you can order this in the description box. God bless you. Thanks for watching. If you watched the whole thing, I so appreciate you being with us today. Shalom.